Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture with leading experts on the Bible, hosted by Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe on our website at thetwotestaments.com, where you can find our library of episodes and donate to support our work. Follow us also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture. I'm Will Kynes.
And I'm Ronnie Cosman.
And in this episode, we're looking at Revelation 12 to 14, and we are joined by Olivia Stewart Lester.
Dr. Olivia Stewart Lester is Assistant Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Loyola University Chicago. And at the Society of Biblical Literature, which is that nerdy biblical studies conference where academics and graduate students meet to nerd out about the Bible and things related. There, Dr. Stewart Lester co-chairs the section on John's Apocalypse and cultural context. That's a mouthful right there, eh? She is the author of this book published by Moore Seebeck titled Prophetic Rivalry, Gender and Economics, a study in Revelation and Sibylline Oracles 4-5. Thanks for joining us, Olivia.
Thanks again for having me.
So, Olivia, what first drew you to the book of Revelation?
Yeah, thanks for asking. You know, it's a mix of kind of pragmatics and content. So I have had a couple of teachers who specialized in the book of Revelation, one very compelling professor when I was an undergraduate, and then another one of my teachers in my graduate training. But I think the interest in the content for me stems both from its prophetic nature. So I've had a long time interest in prophecy. I grew up in different kind of Christian traditions that placed a strong emphasis on the prophetic, and I was really interested in interrogating that. And then I also have a strong interest in women in the New Testament, and Revelation gives us some pretty stark portrayals for good and ill of women. And I was still in college when I read the work of Tina Pippin, who argues that Revelation categorically is unsafe for women. And when I first encountered that, it really troubled me, and it has sat with me and kept me coming back to this text. And the more I read it, the more I'm inclined to think that Tina Pippin is probably onto something, that there are texts certainly that we have to take seriously in terms of their danger with respect to women and other people as well.
Fascinating. I'm sure we'll get into some of that as we talk about chapters 12 through 14. Now, could you summarize briefly for us what do we have here in chapters 12 through 14, and how do you see this section fitting into the book as a whole?
Yeah, so Revelation is organized by 6 visionary cycles with an introductory prologue and a conclusion at the end. And the passage that we'll look at today comprises most of the 4th cycle. So the 2 cycles before ours, which begins actually not at 12:1, but 11:19. That's where we get the formula about the temple in heaven being opened, the Ark of the Covenant being seen. The language of seeing often marks the transition from one cycle to the next. So the 2 cycles before that were sequences of 7 seals in chapters 4 through 8, and then 7 trumpets in 8 through 11. This cycle gives us a very kind of enigmatic description of a woman who gives birth and is attacked by a dragon, followed by some predictions of judgment, moments of kind of promise and hope, an idyllic description of the followers of Jesus as 144,000 who know this secret song, and then a kind of escalating sense of judgment. So this is the 4th visionary cycle. It also falls into the second half of the book. So the 6 cycles really comprise kind of 2 halves. And in the second half, the conflict between God and the destroyers of the world, whether that's the dragon or the beast or Satan, the conflict really escalates until its culmination in chapters kind of 19 and 20 is the sort of denouement.
So we like to ask this question of all of our guests: what's the most difficult thing for you to understand in this passage? And I think that this passage, actually, I've been looking forward to this episode because I think the competition is stiff, but this may be the most weird passage in all of Revelation.
It's very strange.
So there's a lot that's difficult here, but amongst all the difficult things here, what do you find most difficult to interpret?
Yeah, I think 2, and we'll talk about both of them, I'm sure. So one is, how do you identify all of these different figures? Who are these different beasts? Who is this woman? Who is this dragon? And I think something I have found helpful in terms of making sense of that is that we don't necessarily need one identification for each figure that carries all the way through the book. In some ways, Revelation gives us kind of snapshots that are meant to make different points. And that is happening behind the kind of surface level of the text, in part because there are different sources, different texts, different mythic traditions that are getting woven together. So the writer, John, is not primarily interested in kind of one continuous narrative. And then the second thing that is troubling for me and hard for me to make sense of is that God is also a violent character. And that's true not just in these 3 chapters, but across the book of Revelation. And we see that with respect to Jesus as well. And so I try to make sense of that by historicizing it. And then when I read it and I teach it, I try to keep the kind of ethical questions at the forefront and our need to reckon with that as we think about how this text can be understood, read, or even preached.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you keep the ethical question in the forefront instead of pushing it off to the back or to the side and simply treating it as a kind of a historical question. And I'm assuming that's going to open up some different possibilities of and avenues and ways of even thinking about the text as well. Is that right?
It is. And I think for me, and some of this just might be the way that my own mind works, it's not necessarily that the kind of historical and the ethical are separate, but that I have to tackle the ethical through the historical. I feel like I have to historicize it first to try to understand, okay, why are these themes so present in this text? And then at least when I teach it, to offer my students some options. I try not to be prescriptive to them, but say, okay, here's some options with what you can do with this theme of divine violence in the text.
Sure. Great. Now in chapter 12, we read about a conflict or a war, and 2 signs appear in heaven. We read, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. This woman then gives birth, and then there is a second sign, and we read, a great red dragon. And it's a 7-headed dragon and has 10 horns and 7 crowns, and the dragon is fighting against the woman and her son and the angels. Now, who do you think this woman is, and who's the child that she gives birth to? And, something that kind of threw me for a loop is, does she give birth in heaven and then flee to earth, like the wilderness, it says? Or, like, what's happening with her going to the wilderness? Fill us in on some of these details here.
Yeah, it's enigmatic. And it's also an elliptical text. So we're not told everything about this woman. We're left with a lot of questions. In terms of who she is, so we have 4 options probably. One is that she could be a figure for the people of God throughout history. So both Israel and followers of Jesus. Because for John, the writer of Revelation, followers of Jesus belong kind of firmly within Israel. He is writing as a Jewish follower of Jesus, portraying his prophecy about Jesus in a thoroughgoingly Jewish way, weaving together these different Jewish interpretive traditions. So they could be the people of God, sort of writ large. They could be the church, just followers of Jesus, not necessarily inclusive of Israel. It could be Mary, or it could be Israel, not necessarily inclusive of the church. Now, this is where I think it is helpful not necessarily to assume a singular identity for this woman all the way through the chapter. I like to think about the woman here as part of a kind of kaleidoscope. So you have a kaleidoscope that you look at one way and you see a certain set of images and colors and shapes, and then you turn it and things sort of shift again. So I think that insofar as she is giving birth to this baby, I think I'm clear that the baby needs to be understood to be Jesus. This is a messianic figure in the context of Revelation. That is clearly Jesus. Now, later on in the chapter, towards the end, there is a description in verse 17 that the dragon was angry with the woman, went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. So I think there it's a little clearer that the woman is not a singular woman, but rather something like the people of God. I like the interpretation that that's inclusive of ancient Israel and followers of Jesus. But earlier in the chapter, I think it's really important that she is an individual woman who is birthing Jesus. So I'm inclined to say that she's Mary, But the other aspect, when you asked Ronnie about her being in heaven and then she's on earth, and we're not told when that move happens. We're just told that she's described as being in heaven. She gives birth, we don't know where, and at the next point, she's fleeing to the wilderness. But what we, I think, need to emphasize is that her location in heaven is more about her characterization than about the plot. So she's associated with the sun, the moon, and the stars. This kind of cosmic imagery would have been associated with a number of different goddesses in Hellenistic and early Roman context. So I think we should be imagining kind of overtones here of Ephesian Artemis, potentially the Syrian goddess Atargatis, or the Egyptian goddess Isis, and kind of blended together. So she's a sort of cosmic royal figure who then gives birth to Jesus, the Messiah. And I should say, in reading the woman this way, as this kind of cosmic goddess type of figure, I'm really influenced by the work of one of my teachers, Adela Collins, who also has done a lot of work on this passage as tapping into something called a combat myth, which I think we'll talk about in just a few minutes. So Collins differentiates between historical allegory, where you need to see kind of one character identified with one thing all the way through, and what she calls a paradigmatic story, where a story kind of makes a single point. So she tends to see this woman as a paradigm between the conflict between the Jewish people and Rome. I tend to see a shift, so that at the beginning, she really is meant to be seen as the mother of Jesus. At the end, she's meant to figure the people of God.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about the child? So verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. So you mentioned that the child has to be understood as Jesus, but it seems kind of strange in terms of the narrative flow here that as a child, he's snatched away.
Yeah.
Is the snatching away supposed to, because you would think that's referring to the ascension perhaps, but
Right.
It's as a child. So how is that working temporally mapped on to Jesus's story?
Yeah. So John, the writer of Revelation, is so complicated because he's producing his own text, but he's also drawing on all of these different streams of tradition. And here, I think he's very influenced by the mythic pattern of a combat myth. And that's how I make sense of the snatching of the child up, because otherwise we don't have any kind of background for this in any of the narratives about the life of Jesus. So the combat myth, fundamentally, the kind of narrative frame that appears in lots of different ancient cultures, in Akkadian, in Hittite, in Ugaritic, in Egyptian, Greek, and also Jewish texts. We see combat myths in various places in the Hebrew Bible. The basic story is this. So there's a monster or a god associated with chaos who attacks a god to try to stop their reign. And in many cases, they're successful even to the extent that the god dies. Now, I think for a variety of reasons, John wants to draw on a combat myth, but probably doesn't want his god to die yet, right? John will talk about the lamb that was slaughtered, but this is the moment when it happens. And the death of John's God or John's Messiah isn't early on, it's at the crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. So I think the snatching up to heaven is the kind of equivalent of the God vanishing through death. And then in the general version of this combat myth, the God returns, helped by a wife or a sister or a mother or a son, defeats the monster and restores order. And so I think John is drawing on this kind of mythic trope, and that's why the child vanishes, because otherwise it just really doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So the combat myth, you mentioned all of these ancient cultures where they have these combat myths, but when I teach this text to my undergraduates, I actually show them some scenes from the Avengers. So the original Avengers movie.
Yeah.
And at the end, I don't know how familiar you are with this movie, but at the end of it, there are these alien things, but they're depicted as like dragons, and they come down out of the heavens, and then all the Avengers fight against them, but particularly Iron Man, who I didn't imagine when this podcast started I'd be talking about Iron Man and describing the plot of the Avengers movie, but Iron Man, who's kind of the protagonist of the Avengers in that movie, he ends up taking this nuclear bomb into the origins of the aliens, right? And then he goes up so high that I don't know what happens, like he loses oxygen or whatever, but then he falls to the earth.
Yeah.
And crashes into the earth. And as he falls, of course, he's briefly in a kind of crucifix position. So this idea that like this is not just an ancient thing. Like, this is still something that resonates in our culture even today in multi-billion-dollar blockbuster movies. It just is a fascinating feature, and I think it really brings this text to life for my students, because yes, this is all very like combat myths in the Bible, but one of the things I use that to get across to the students is when I first watched the Avengers with my kids, I remember looking over at them during this whole scene, this whole battle, and they're really worried and anxious about what's going to happen, right? So the way that, and I love that you referred to Collins, because I really like the way that Collins, and I don't know if it's John or Adela who puts it this way, but that in Revelation we have we have exhortation and consolation through the shaping of the imagination, right? So this imaginary shaping in which we are drawn into the anxiety of this moment in the combat, like who is going to win, just like my kids were when they watched the Avengers. And then when there's the victory at the end, there's this feeling of triumph. Now, all we've done is sat on a couch for 2 hours, but we've gone through this whole emotional experience, which is a powerful thing.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. I think it's even more true when we think about the precarity of this woman and this infant. And, childbirth is always a vulnerable thing. It is up until the present moment today. Maternal mortality is still a real risk, but how much more so in the late first century. And so the description of the woman in verse 2, she's crying out in birth pangs in the agony of giving birth. And it is this supremely vulnerable, tiny child that is taken up to heaven too. And so I think the anxiety is even sort of heightened. And, Collins, in reading the woman as a figure for the struggle between Jewish people and the Roman Empire, argues that all of John's audience was meant to identify with this woman, with her kind of precarity and her pain and her vulnerability.
Now, Olivia, you've written on the Apollo tradition in particular, right? And you've kind of talked about how Revelation 12 is kind of reworking that tradition and maybe critiquing it or doing something with it. Can you tell us what is this tradition and how do you see this kind of combat myth interacting with it?
So there are all these different cross-cultural iterations of this combat myth, but there's a cluster of them that divide into different versions about the god Apollo. Now, all of those versions put the site of the combat between Apollo and Python, is the monster, at Delphi, which becomes the most dominant prophetic shrine associated with Apollo, the most kind of famous across the ancient world. Now, there's a version where Python doesn't attack Apollo. Python attacks Apollo's mother, Leto, as she's giving birth. And so that, I think, is the version that is closest. And this isn't unique to me. This is also Collins's argument, that this version in Revelation 12, because the monster attacks not the hero, but the mother, looks very much like Leto. Now, what I think is happening there, and this is where my own kind of opinion takes over, is that there is a kind of critique being levied, that what John does is take this tradition about the birth of Apollo and say, this is actually about Jesus. And Jesus, it turns out, is superior to Apollo in many ways, especially as being a source of true prophecy. So I think there's a little bit of an edge here about Jesus versus Apollo and the true prophecy of Revelation, the true prophecy that Jesus inspires, contrasted with the false prophecy that John would say comes out of Delphi. And the last kind of wrinkle here is that prophecy is not an apolitical phenomenon. It's certainly not now, and it wasn't in the ancient world either. So Delphic prophecy was very closely associated with Roman emperors. Emperors like Nero consulted the shrine, engaged in imperial patronage. They paid for building projects. Now, it's not kind of an easy relationship across the board between emperors and the Delphic shrine, but there are enough links between the two institutions that I think this is not just a kind of prophetic critique, but also a political one. And, John is anti-Rome all the way through Revelation. And this is just one more place that I see that happening.
So the next part, it kind of reminds me of horror movies and the way that you have, often this young woman who's the protagonist who's being chased. And so we see a similar kind of situation here, which I think also may be appealing to us as readers emotionally, and those same kind of fears we have about vulnerability. And it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on that and the way that that's depicting women in this passage. But the dragon's thrown down and lands on the earth and then goes after the woman and the child. But the woman receives 2 wings of the great eagle so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness to where she is nourished for a time and times and a half a time. So that's verse 14. Mm-hmm. So what is the significance of these 2 wings of the great eagle? And does the woman hiding and being nourished in the wilderness signify something? I guess we can assume it's in Revelation. It does. There's got to be something going on there. So what's happening?
Yeah, whether I can identify the single thing it signifies is a bigger question, but I can give you some choices. So the first thing to note is that this is another parallel with the Leto Apollo Python, because Leto escapes on the north wind. So a kind of an escape assisted by the natural world in some way. That's another parallel. But it's not the wind, it's the 2 wings of an eagle. And this is where I think John shifts registers from this kind of combat myth focalized in a Roman context right back to Jewish scriptural texts. So I think we should be in mind here of texts like Exodus 19:4, where God delivers Israel on eagle's wings. That's the description of the Exodus, that in the face of the Egyptians, God brought Israel to God's self on the wings of an eagle. Or Deuteronomy 32:10-12, where God is like an eagle hovering over its young. Or even Isaiah 40:31, where those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength and they'll mount up on wings like eagles. So I think there is a very much a kind of Jewish scriptural influence happening there with the eagle. And then her location in the wilderness, we could also translate this term as the desert, the wilderness. Either way, it's the kind of space where we have seen figures such as Hagar or Moses or David or numerous prophets flee from their enemies and find divine provision. We can even think about Israel being fed with manna in the wilderness in Exodus 16, or the prophet Elijah being fed with bread and meat in 1 Kings 17 and 19. And I should say here and throughout, I'm really influenced not just by Adela Collins's reading of Revelation, but also Craig Kester, who has a fantastic commentary in the Anchor Yale Bible series on the book of Revelation. And these kinds of connections he just draws so nicely. So that's the woman on the eagle in the desert. The timing of it, the 1,260 days, or the times and half a time, I think should take us to Daniel 7. I'll say for now, it's a way of understanding John's own current moment after the life and death of Jesus and before the return of Jesus. And we might go to Daniel 7 together in a minute, but maybe not right this second, because it surfaces again and again in this chapter.
Great. So the dragon fails to catch the woman, so then wages war on her children.
Yeah.
Right. So the dragon can't catch the woman, makes war on the children. And now we're going to shift to chapter 13, where we see the dragon standing on the seashore. And then we're going to be introduced to these 2 beasts that are associated with the dragon. Now, the first beast has 10 horns and 7 heads and is like a leopard with bare feet and a lion's mouth. And this beast receives its throne power and authority from the dragon. So the dragon confers its authority on this first beast. And we read that one of its heads received a death blow or a mortal wound or something like that, but it was healed. Actually, this kind of description surfaces repeatedly in these chapters of this kind of mortal wound, but then is healed. And then the whole earth follows the beast, worshiping the dragon and the beast. Okay, what is going on with this beast, this mortal wound? What's it doing? How's it functioning here in Revelation?
Yeah, we have some doctoral students here at Loyola who, when they teach Revelation, they usually do this with the throne room description. will have their students try to draw what the text says. And I think if you do that here, you're ending up with this kind of composite, all of these different animals smushed together. You can't even visualize what this is describing. And this is where I do think we should go to Daniel 7, because what happens in Daniel 7 is we have a series of different beasts, certainly fantastical, but a little more intelligible. And what John does in Revelation is to smush all these different beasts together into one. So it's a real kind of hybrid being. So I think we should look together, if it's okay, at Daniel 7, 1 through 8. And then we might do 13 through 27, if that's okay, because that really will be very relevant for the rest of 12 through 14 in Revelation. So Daniel 7, 1. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and vision of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. Another beast appeared, a second one, that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth, and was told, arise, devour many bodies. After this, as I watched, another appeared like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads. Dominion was given to it. After this, I saw in the visions by night a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one, coming up among them to make room for it. 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. Now, I might have overplayed it a little bit to say that this is totally intelligible, but at least they're different beings, right? You can kind of picture, okay, there's a lion with eagle's wings, a leopard, and a bear, but suddenly in Revelation, they're all compacted together. So then if we jump down to Daniel 7:13, as I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being, or son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was troubled within me, and the visions of my head terrified me. I approached one of the attendants to ask him the truth concerning all this. So he said that he would disclose to me the interpretation of the matter. As for these great 4 beasts, 4 kings shall arise out of the earth. But the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Then I desired to know the truth concerning the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet, and concerning the 10 horns that were on its head, and concerning the other horn, which came up, and to make room for which 3 of them fell out, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke arrogantly, and that seemed greater than the others. As I looked, this horn made war with the holy ones, and was prevailing over them, until the Ancient One came. Then judgment was given for the holy ones of the Most High, and the time arrived when the holy ones gained possession of the kingdom. This is what he said. As for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth that shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. This one shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High, and shall attempt to change the sacred seasons and the law. For they shall be given into his power for a time, 2 times, and half a time. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and totally destroyed. The kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. So that's a long text, but a lot of this imagery will surface throughout the rest of Revelation 12 through 14. And a quick kind of sketch of what's happening in Daniel, and then we'll jump back to Revelation 12. So Daniel is taking a very common motif of 4 kingdoms. We see this series of predictions of 4 kingdoms in a variety of ancient literatures, Greek, Persian, Jewish. It's a way of talking about the unfolding of time in response to a series of actual empires: the Babylonian Empire, the Medes, the Persians, and Greece. Now, the 4th beast here is Greece, but really it's the Seleucids. It's the successors of Alexander the Great and all of the Seleucid rulers that follow. And one of them, Antiochus Epiphanes, the 4th, was a real problem for ancient Jews. He was extremely hostile to them. We read accounts about how troublesome he was to them and the Maccabean revolt kind of in response to that in some of the books of Maccabees. So Daniel describes this succession of kingdoms as 4 different beasts, and then the last beast has 10 horns. They are different individual rulers, the worst of them being Antiochus Epiphanes. John takes this imagery and really just smushes it together. So the 10 horns and 7 heads, this is a description not just of that first beast, but also of the dragon. We read that the dragon has 10 horns and 7 heads at the end of verse 3. So that's a connection that's meant to say, okay, this beast is an agent of the dragon who is Satan. We're a little clearer on the dragon. But the first beast is described with all of this different composite imagery. It is also that 10 horns, 7 heads thing. That's the same number of heads and horns if you put all of Daniel's creatures together. So it's a kind of amalgam. Now, I think the best understanding of this beast is that it is kind of simultaneously one Roman ruler and all of them at the same time. So the wound that it has sustained, there's a couple of different possibilities for this. It might have been Julius Caesar, who was obviously mortally wounded, and yet the Roman Empire continued after him. There were more Caesars. I think most likely it's a reference to Nero. So you may or may not be familiar with these traditions about figures like Elvis or Tupac, that they never really die, right? That they're just off somewhere else. There were similar associations with Nero in antiquity, either that he hadn't really died, because very few people witnessed his death, that perhaps he's fled to the Parthians and he'll make this magisterial return. Later on, there were texts that talk about, Nero really did die, but he would in fact return anyways. And so Nero, in Revelation and in texts like some of the Jewish Sibylline oracles, actually becomes this figure rendered more terrifying by the fact that, death isn't the end for him. And in Revelation, it becomes a kind of counterpoint to the Lamb who has died and will also return. So I think the beast here is meant to be Nero, but not just as Nero, as a stand-in for Roman rule writ large.
Good.
Yeah.
It's all clear now.
Yes.
It's amazing how you did that.
Solved it.
Now, is there a development in the earth's posture towards the woman and the dragon beast? Because in chapter 12, when the dragon tries to sweep away the woman with the flood waters that pour out of the dragon's mouth, which is interesting imagery in itself, but then the earth itself actually comes to the woman's aid and swallows the river that comes from the dragon's mouth. And then we read in 13:3-4 that the whole earth followed the beast and worshiped both the beast and the dragon. Now, there could be like a double meaning here with earth, right? So earth could actually be the physical earth, and then later it could be all the people on the earth. But talk us through what's going on here.
Yeah, I'm inclined to interpret it the way that you did just at the end there, to differentiate between the natural order, which comes to the aid of the woman, and the people of the earth. And not to get too nerdy about it, but it is, I think, worth noting that the Greek in verse 3 is a little bit awkward. So literally it's just the whole earth was amazed after the beast, which isn't the normal way that you would express that. And I think the formulation is much clearer in verse 8, where it says that all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it. So I think that earth there in verse 3 is kind of shorthand for the people of the earth, rather than there being a kind of meaningful shift in terms of the created order and whose side they're on in this conflict.
What about the water getting shot out of the dragon's mouth and then the actual earth swallowing the water up? Does that have some kind of mythic undertones that help illuminate that?
Yes. With respect to the woman in 12, you mean, with the water getting shot out? Yeah. So in the Lido version, it's Poseidon. So I think the water and Poseidon there are meant to be kind of parallel images again.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I mean that reinforces reading chapter 12 through the Apollo myth. Yeah. Which I mean, the more of those little resonances you get, the more that strengthens that argument, which is fascinating.
Although I will say it's not the only way to read it. You know, I think this is one compelling way to make sense of it. I've heard some great work comparing the birth of his child and Dionysus as well. You know, I think it's not just one kind of mythic trope. It's like this sort of multi-layered thing that John is doing here.
Now, in 13 verse 10, there's an interesting and I think kind of surprising intrusion, it seems like, into what we've read about the beast being given worship and authority. And we read this, it kind of just interjects. If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you kill with the sword you must be killed. Here is a call for the endurance and the faith of the saints. What is going on here? Why is this kind of just jumping in, in this part of Revelation?
So thinking about the timeline again, you know, John is describing this middle period, this times and half a time. It's the kind of time period that was evoked by the woman who continues to remain on earth and under threat from the dragon at the end of 12. It is described in 13:7 as the time when the beast was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And so what I think is happening in verses 9 and 10 is John breaks the fourth wall briefly and says, okay, here's the moment that you're in. You're in this time when the beast is making war on the followers of Jesus. Here is how you audience members need to conduct yourselves. If you're taken captive, you go into captivity. If you kill with the sword you'll be killed. So in other words, this isn't a call to politically violent revolution. This is a call to wait for the deferred violent divine judgment. It's not necessarily a path of anti-violence, I wouldn't say, because I think that John just projects the violence into the future and says, God's going to do it. You don't do it. But that's how I see that fitting. And I think it's closely tied to verse 7, to the war that's being described.
Yeah, so it's kind of in the same sense of the tradition of you leave vengeance to the Lord, you leave vengeance to God, you don't take it upon yourself.
Yeah.
Would you say, is that kind of what's going on? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's also, Craig Kester argues this, that these verses are both about comfort to the faithful audiences and also a prophetic warning. So if there is a war that's happening and the beast is making war, this line about if you kill with the sword you'll be killed is pretty ominous.
And then in verse 11, we get yet another beast.
Yeah.
So if you hadn't had enough beasts, here's another one for you. It has two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. So interesting, like a lamb and like a dragon, which there are two protagonists here. And then it exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and makes the earth worship the first beast. It performs great signs and deceives the inhabitants of the earth to make an image of the first beast, and then it gives spirit to this image. And then, in true Left Behind fashion, it brands the name of the beast or the number of the beast on people's foreheads or right hand, without which no one can buy or sell. And as we all know, that number is 666. So this is the moment that our listeners have been waiting for this entire season. Dr. Stewart Lester is going to explain to us the mark of the beast. So first, let's talk about who this extra beast is, and then we can get into the real meat of that big question.
Yeah. So I think the second beast is best understood as the supporters of the Roman imperial cult. So there were sites where Roman emperors were worshipped as gods. Now, I don't think we can be more specific than that. There are different proposals. Are these priests of the imperial cult? Are these local councils that institute the cults? Are they Christians who are comfortable with imperial cults as part of like kind of syncretistic worship? I don't think we can say any more than just these are supporters of the imperial cult. This is how we make sense of the language of worshiping the first beast. Also the language of exercising the authority of the first beast on its behalf. The idea here is that in the political and administrative structures of more localized regions, the evils of Rome are still kind of being felt, and they are at their worst when they are being worshipped through the emperor cult. Now, the irony here is that there is another reference. Ronnie, you said, this language of a mortal wound comes up several times. We have it again in verse 12, that the beast is the one whose mortal wound had been healed. Now, if this is about Nero, there were no temple cults of Nero in Asia. So in some ways, this is another kind of criticism, a kind of lampooning of Nero. Saying, on the one hand, the imperial cult is very evil and we should be afraid of it, but Nero didn't even get one in Asia. And someone like Sarah Emanuel has argued fairly recently that Revelation uses humor as well, that there's kind of satire and parody embedded in even some of its most polemical language. So second beast, I think, is supporters of the imperial cult. Now, what about the 666? So 666.
Yeah, like is 666, like this is not like the chip in my credit card, without which I can't buy food and drink and that kind of thing.
No, although the money thing is interesting. I'm not saying it's the chip in your credit card. Let me be very, very clear. But the language of a mark, a charagma, is used for the stamp on coins and stamped documents. So there is a sense, I think, in John's mind that certain kinds of commercial activity, it's too much kind of embeddedness in the surrounding world. He really is arguing for a kind of separatism. But that 666 is not a credit card. It is, again, a reference to Nero. So if you transliterate Nero with an N at the end, Neron, Caesar, into Hebrew and then apply gematria to it, the system by which different Hebrew letters are given different numerical values, you get 666. And I have a list here of how that all breaks down, but I'm not going to bore your listeners with that. So they can find it, I'm sure, somewhere on the internet. Right. But I will say I think the best interpretation is Nero Caesar.
Yeah, because so John is basically inviting his readers to do exactly that. So in verse 18, he says, "Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast," and here's the number. It's like, so I guess he could just come right out and say Nero, but why does he decide to do it this way instead? I mean, he's used imagery in the past, as you've suggested, probably to allude to Nero. Now he's going to be a little bit more explicit. He's going to be like, well, it's not Nero, but it rhymes with hero.
And I really think he's a zero.
Yeah. Like, why is he getting a little bit more explicit, but then still not willing to quite come out and say it?
Yeah, I think two possibilities. One is just this is the type of text that John is writing. It's not the first of its kind. A text like Daniel and many other prophetic texts, you have all of this very veiled imagery that is about kind of let the reader understand. And it invites kind of study and repeated encounter and interpretation, and it allows for updating. So if you think about the relationship between Daniel and Jeremiah, for example, there's a very concrete prophecy about how long captivity is going to last. And Daniel reworks it and makes it a little more mysterious and adds a little more kind of flexibility to it. So I think some of it is about genre. John is writing a prophetic text that we would now call also an apocalypse. And there's a lot of mystery and symbolism embedded in that. I also think, so John is a very, kind of unknown figure on the landscape of the Roman Empire. He's on Patmos, not at the kind of heart of the imperial center. But he doesn't name names. He doesn't name any Roman emperor. And I think we can ask, how politically dangerous would it be to be very explicit? I mean, because the judgment described here is stark and violent, and he'll name Rome, fairly clearly as Babylon. And, I think a knowing reader would understand that this is Nero. But again, he is sort of covering his tracks a little bit with some of this language, I think.
Now, maybe chapter 14 helps us understand a little bit too what it means to have this, number 666 kind of branded on your forehead or your wrist. So in chapter 14, John sees the Lamb standing on Mount Zion with 144,000 who have his name, so the name of the Lamb and the name of the Father's name on their foreheads.
Yes.
Now, there's a new song that's being sung that no one can learn except the 144,000. It's really interesting. So who are these 144,000? What is this, branding of the Lamb and the Father's name on their foreheads? And why do they get to learn the secret song? And what's the deal with this new song?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I agree with you, first of all, that connection is absolutely there between the mark of the beast and then the name that is born on the head. And I think we should think about commands in the Jewish scriptures to keep God's word close, on your head and on your heart and on your hands. And obviously, different readers have taken that with varying degrees of literalness. But certainly there's a parallel here between the mark of the beast and the name of the Father and the Lamb on the foreheads of the 144,000. I think they're best understood as the elect. Numerically, this is a multiple of 12 of the 12 tribes of Israel. I think that is intentional. I think it is worth noting that they are described as men in verse 4 who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. There's a couple of possibilities here in terms of why they're described exactly this way. Are they the antithesis to the Watchers, those who did defile themselves with women and kind of introduced evil and chaos into the world as a result? I think more compelling is the suggestion from people like Lynn Huber that these are an idealized counterpoint to imperial masculinity. So this is not the paterfamilias who is married and fathers lots of children. This is a virginal man, but I think also still an ideally masculine man. There's been a lot of work on masculinity in Revelation, how the Lamb and God are sort of hyper-masculine, militarized figures. And I think we should interpret these 144,000 as belonging to that kind of ethos, but in a different way. So offering a counter proposal to Roman imperial masculinity here. In terms of the song, so how we translate verse 3 is a little bit up for debate. The Greek verb is manthano. It could mean to learn. Many English translations take it that way, but it could also be translated as understand. And if we take it as understand, then I think we can open up the possibility that someone else is singing the song. So if we look at verse 2, John says, I heard a voice from heaven, like the sound of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. Now, harps would have been common accompaniment for singing in this time period. So they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. No one could understand that song except the 144,000 who have been redeemed from the earth. So I think John is hearing a heavenly song, and it's only the elect who, if you will, have been initiated into the mystery so that they can understand this song. So, I suggested that their kind of virginal masculinity is tapping into larger conversations about masculinity in the Roman Empire. I think the secrecy of this song is tapping into other kind of mystery cults, or, the emphasis on secrecy in things like Isis or Dionysus cults that John presents them as a sort of counterpoint.
On the point of masculinity, when I was reading through this text preparing for today, and I got to verse 4, and it said, they have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. I had to read it twice because I can't think of another place in the Bible where men are referred to as virgins.
Yeah,
And I had to go back, like, are we talking about women here? Where did these women come from? Just, would that be the case that this is the one example? Or, I mean, it's at least unusual.
Yeah, it's very unusual. I'm always loath to say this is the only one,
Yeah,
because I don't have a kind of encyclopedic recall.
Exactly, yeah.
But it's very, very unusual. But, I think any suggestion that these are women, it just doesn't make sense with the preceding clause. They're virgins
I'm
because
not
they
suggesting.
haven't.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that they are. What I'm suggesting is that it's just instinctual when I read virgin in the Bible, I think woman, because every time it's referring to women.
Absolutely.
And so it threw me off. But I mean, that raises these kind of gender issues that are being inserted into this text. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going a little bit afield here, but I'm sure I don't have the Greek text in front of me. Is it obvious that when it says, what verse is the virgins? Verse 4. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. Is it for they are virgins? Does that necessarily refer to the men, or can it refer to the women?
Grammatically, it's always possible to go either way. But for me, the gar there makes me think it's the explanation for the men. They're the ones who haven't defiled themselves with women because they are virgins, for they are virgins. So there's nothing in parthenoi that, makes it have to be masculine or feminine because it's a noun. But I think that the way that the verse is phrased has to be the men.
Sure. So the other interesting thing about the way they're described is they have been redeemed from humankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb, and in their mouth no lie was found. They are blameless.
Yeah.
So would you see the kind of mark on the forehead then, or taking on a mark on the forehead? Are these kind of descriptors what it means to take the mark on the forehead, or is just taking the mark on the forehead simply this idea of kind of devotion there are those who are devoted to the beast, they have his mark on their head, and then there are those who have the mark of the Lamb and the Father on their forehead, which just signifies that they have an allegiance or devotion to, the Lamb and the Father.
Yeah, it's hard to know what the causality here is in verse 4 and 5. I think I'm sort of inclined to say we have all of these descriptors and we know that they go together, but the text doesn't give us enough to say whether one causes the other. I think, we just perhaps want a little bit more explanation there and don't get it, unfortunately.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to verses 6 to 11. And here, John sees 3 angels and hears them speak. So what is the effect and the significance of these 3 angels speaking one after the other? And what do they say?
Yeah, so they all give, I think, kind of escalating portrayals of judgment. So the angels here are functioning very much as divine messengers. The first message in verse 7 is to fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water. So that one's not too ominous. It's mostly a call to worship, but there is a mention already that the hour of judgment has come. And if we remember that this section is the first part of the second half of the book of Revelation. And the second half is where the conflict between God and the destroyers of the world escalates and comes to a head. I think what we're getting in this kind of quick sequence of angelic messengers is an escalation of the tension. The kind of ominous foreboding is ratcheting up. Something serious is about to happen. And indeed, the next 2 explanations of God's judgment will be borne out in subsequent chapters. So in some ways, this is sort of literary foreshadowing, but it's presented as a done deal or a kind of fait accompli. This is already finished, and yet we're going to watch this unfold. So the second message is in verse 8, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. This will be elaborated in great detail in 17 and 18. And then the third message is the longest. Those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads or on their hands, They will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger, and they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast and its image, and for anyone who receives the mark of its name. And we'll get a description of God's judgment as a kind of divine harvesting later on in this very same chapter, actually.
So that description of, of punishment, right? There'll be, like you just read, there'll be torment with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the Lamb. The smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There's no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image. Okay. How should we understand this punishment? Is this kind of, do you see this as a kind of conscious, unending torment, kind of like what we might see when I teach in our kind of great books class when we get to Dante's Inferno, right? You get this picture of people who just continue to suffer, unending, unceasing, and they're aware of their torment. Is that the kind of picture that we have going on here? Maybe not in the same, exact same image as Dante, or is it something else going on? Are we misreading, overreading, or do you think that's actually something like what John's Apocalypse has in mind?
I do, actually. I think my approach to divine violence more broadly in the text is first to kind of try and take it at face value, and then to try to historicize it, and then to say, okay, what do we do with this? And I do think this is a description of unending, painful torment inflicted by God as judgment for worshiping the wrong being. And this is not an isolated incident. There are lots of instances of divine judgment taking on a violent form. For me, another one of the most difficult examples is in the messages to the assemblies in Revelation 2, where the Son of God says that he will throw Jezebel on a bed and strike her children dead. And I want to flag that I'm going to say something, difficult to hear, I think, with respect to sexual violence. But I think that passage shows the Son of God not just as violent, but indeed as sexually violent to Jezebel. That language of throwing her on a bed can mean a number of things. It can be a sick bed or a funeral bier, but it's also a site of sex. And I think that the punishment there is meant to fit the crime that John describes, which includes sexual immorality. And so we see, I think, throughout the book of Revelation, whether it is the Son of God or the Lamb or God, described as inflicting violence in judgment. Now, how do we make sense of that? This is a difficult thing to grapple with. And I think especially for people who are reading this text as scripture and thinking about using it in religious communities. And I want to name that. This is really hard. But I think that in order to use these texts responsibly, we have to face this kind of stuff. So in order to make sense of it, I would say a couple of things. One, there's been some, I think, compelling work, again, by Adela Collins, on the ways that John is trying to make sense of suffering that he has experienced and that he perceives. So that suffering would include the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70, which I think was a trauma on the landscape of ancient Judaism that we can never overestimate. And Sarah Emanuel's work speaks to this too, that there is trauma that John is working out. I think the death of Antipas as well, a follower of Jesus who's named in Revelation 2. I think that was another kind of trauma that John is trying to metabolize. And the way that he does that is to write a text that creates an imagined universe shot through with violence, where the people who have inflicted violence on those that John associates himself with will in turn suffer violence in retribution. It doesn't justify it, but it does help us to locate it. And then the third thing is that the genre John chooses, both prophecy and apocalypse, those two genres, ancient and modern, that John chooses to write with, are texts that also employ violence. It's part of the logic of how this literature works. So I think what we have to do is to start by historicizing and say there are all of these reasons why this text describes God in these ways. Now, whether one should continue to describe God in those ways, I think is a question that each kind of reader has to grapple with seriously.
Yeah. Well, we're going to jump now from eternal conscious torment We've already looked at the mark of the beast and the dragon, and now we're going to look at the grim reaper. So we're just not letting you get a break here. I'm sorry, Olivia.
That's okay.
Just from one to the next, but that's what John does to us, right?
Yeah.
Just throws these images at us one after the other. So verses 14 to 20, we get the angels coming out of the temple and out of the altar, which is interesting in itself. If you want to talk about that, you can. But then we get this one like the Son of Man with a crown and a sickle, and then an angel calling the Son of Man to reap the earth's harvest in verse 15. And then another angel comes with a sharp sickle, and an angel with authority over fire tells the angel to use his sickle and gather the ripe grapes. And then the grapes are thrown in the great winepress of the wrath of God outside the city in verses 17 to 20. So what is the Son of Man and his angels doing here? And, we might think it's good to be a ripe grape, but it certainly seems like here the imagery is reversed. So talk us through this grim reaper sickle thing that's going on, and then also the winepress of God's wrath.
There's a lot happening in this passage, that is for sure. So first, to start with the angels, it's worth noting that angels in Revelation function as divine messengers. We already saw that in the just immediately preceding section, and they do that to some extent here. But in terms of them coming out from the temple or the altar, they also serve as kind of priestly functionaries at a couple of places in Revelation. So in Revelation 8, 3 through 5, they are right at the altar kind of ministering. And in Revelation 15, 5 through 8, they're kind of pouring out these libation bowls. So I think we should allow for angels to have multiple functions here, that they are both coming out as kind of emissaries, but also they're priestly functionaries in some way too. So that's why they're at the altar, I think. In terms of the Son of Man, so we have to think back again to Daniel 7. There was that passage about the Son of Man, or sometimes it's translated as one like a human being, coming on the clouds, and that to him will be given dominion and glory, etc. The phrase, the Son of Man, is one of those expressions that is chock full of meaning in ancient Jewish literature. So as I'm sure, Will, you know better than I do, but it begins as a generic way of speaking about a human being. So, for example, in Ezekiel was referred to as Son of Man a number of times, and that really should just be understood as human person. But then in the Second Temple period, it begins to take on many more associations of kind of messianic overtones, militaristic overtones, and royal overtones. And by the time we get to a text like Mark 13, which redeploys Daniel 7, all of that imagery is at play. So I might actually just read a couple of verses from Mark 13, just because I think it helps us get into the kind of headspace then that sort of shifts us from Daniel 7 to Revelation. So Mark 13, 24 through 27. In those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. So jumping back to Revelation now, there are some who would say that that first harvest in verses 15 and 16 is a positive one, that this is kind of the harvest of the faithful. This is the gathering of the elect. I'm a little bit agnostic on that because I just don't think we have enough information to make that call one way or the other. I certainly think the next harvest is not a positive one, and all interpreters would agree on that. But the shift from the harvest with the sickle to the second sickle, the kind of wine and grape imagery harvest, I think here we need to look instead at Joel 3:13. And this is the last place I'm going to take us outside of Revelation, but I do think that this is really relevant for us. So Joel 3, I'll read 11 to 13. Come quickly, all you nations all around. Gather yourselves there. Bring down your warriors, O Lord. Let the nations rouse themselves and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the neighboring nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Go in, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. So divine judgment figured as a grape harvest, or the kind of pressing of grapes in a wine press, is very much an idea that John is drawing on Joel, perhaps also a couple of verses in Isaiah. Again, divine judgment is figured as the kind of pressing of the winepress. So certainly there, it is not a positive thing at all.
Yeah, that's interesting. The let me ask maybe so we don't end on such a dire note, but sometimes it's okay to end on such pessimistic.
I know it's
outcomes
really
as
not
well.
like an upper these chapters. I am so sorry.
Well, I mean, going with that, it is interesting that in chapter 14, verse 6, that there's an angel who's flying in heaven and has an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth and to every nation and tribe and language and people. And presumably this is the eternal gospel that the angel proclaims. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water." So, I mean, that's really an interesting kind of key. I think probably most listeners, when they think of the term gospel, they tend to think of it in this positive kind of, like good, happy, harps in heaven, saved from, sin. But here, the gospel is God's judgment coming to earth. Yeah. So it seems like John almost sees all this judgment stuff that that me as a kind of modern reader, I'm taking as like, oh gosh, this is awful. John sees this as positive, it seems, and as good news, as gospel. So there's that. And maybe if you want to comment on anything I've just said there, go ahead. But the other question I was going to ask you is, how does John envision that someone escapes? Is there a way to get out of this judgment and land on the other side of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is an exercise in hope for John to write this text. And I think that we have to sort of hold that intention with the way that this text, for many readers, evokes horror now. And yet it is for John an envisioning of accountability happening for things that he perceives as evil. And modern readers would probably disagree with some of the things that John perceives as evil. But if we think about the description of the excesses of Babylon, a very, very difficult text, Revelation 17 and 18. But one of the commodities that Babylon trades in with these merchants and kings of the earth is the souls of human beings. And I think that kind of critique of the way that humanity buys and sells the humanity of others, commodifies actual human beings. And John is horrified by this. And he envisions a world in which that ends, and God punishes that evil as evil. And so I do think for John's logic, there is a certain hope. There's a certain good news embedded in that message of divine judgment. And certainly there have been marginalized readers throughout human history that find Revelation as an expression of their own struggle and suffering and desire for a universe in which they are not so powerless. So, I think it's one thing for me as an interpreter who is, kind of white woman in the year of 2023 to say, out of my place of relative privilege, there are lots of aspects of this text that really trouble me. And yet to acknowledge that other readers, and certainly the writer, experience this as an expression of deep hope in many ways. And there are passages in Revelation that are inspiring and beautiful. The promise that God will wipe away every tear from the eyes of those who weep. That is a lovely hope and a real kind of promise of consolation. I think I just continue to struggle with the other elements of the book. And I feel that to handle it responsibly, we can't overlook those aspects, even if we emphasize the moments of kind of hope and beauty and justice.
Great. That's a more positive place for us to finish things up, in that we do find, at least some readers can find hope here in those who have faced injustice, that injustice will ultimately be judged. And so for some readers, that could be a great source of hope. Great. Well, let's finish with a final question that we like to ask our guests, which is for a blurb, right? So you're, I'm sure, very familiar with blurbs that are on the back of all these books, and biblical scholars love their blurbs. So is there anything that you'd like to blurb for us? And it doesn't have to be a book. It could be anything that you've recently discovered that you think our listeners might enjoy as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect this isn't so revolutionary because I think a lot of people are liking this at the moment, but I'm halfway through the second season of The Bear, the TV show, and I do think that that is, it's a really kind of beautiful and hard exploration of the human experience, you know, kind of taking seriously what does the aftermath of loss look like? How do we think about things like chosen family and reconstituted community? And at least a couple of those themes, funnily enough, are shared with the book of Revelation, I suppose, the kind of grappling with loss and thinking about new communities. But I found The Bear, you know, I live in Chicago and it's like a love letter to the city. So I'm enjoying it. And I think it's gives a lot of food for thought.
So that sandwich that, like, I've only watched the first episode, but the sandwich that they make that they're like famous for there, that's a Chicago thing. Have you had that sandwich, and does it live up to the hype?
Yeah, there's lots of different versions of that sandwich. And it is pretty good. I will say I went just a month ago or so to the place that makes the chocolate cake, which appears quite often in The Bear. And that restaurant also was well worth a visit. So, you know, it's a love letter to Chicago and also to its food scene, which is really fun.
What is the sandwich? Do you like?
It's just called an Italian beef.
Yeah. Okay. The Italian beef. So next time you're in Chicago, check out the Italian beef.
Yeah.
Wow.
And if you want a good show to watch, The Bear is recommended to us.
Well, I hope The Bear lives up to your recommendation, because there was a guest who recommended a show, and I won't say who the guest was or what the show is now. And I went and I tried to watch the show, and I'm like, good grief, how could anyone get into this show?
Oh, no. I mean, it's a real, like, it'll put you through the ringer emotionally, but it's a great show.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I would say, so I did watch the first episode, and my wife and I agreed it was a little intense for us. And then we put it aside and we just haven't come back to it. But it's very well done. Like, the acting is incredible and everything. It has the other problem of making me really hungry.
Yeah,
it's
that's
in
true
a restaurant. So when you watch it, you be prepared, eat a good meal beforehand. Great. Well, thank you so much, Olivia, for taking the time to wrestle with this very difficult set of chapters and provide so much illumination, looking underneath these difficult images and giving them new meaning for us. We really do appreciate it. And for you listeners, you know, these are some of the images and texts in Revelation that lots of people struggle with. And maybe people have been asking you questions about it, and maybe you've had questions answered today that you've always wondered about. Well, if that's the case, maybe you could share this episode with someone else. Send it to them. You know, the last person who tried to claim that some political figure was marked by the mark of the beast, or said you can't use a credit card because of those implications. Here, this might help clarify things for them. So spread the knowledge that you've gained today with others. We'd appreciate it. Thanks for listening.
This episode is co-sponsored by Samford University and the Alabama Humanities Alliance, a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this episode do not necessarily represent those of the Alabama Humanities Alliance, the National Endowment for the Humanities, or Samford University. Thanks also to the Faculty Success Center and our student assistants for their help with production and promotion.